Well, good evening. It's good to see you here tonight. But I have to say, it's disappointing to not see more people here. But it reveals the exact problem that I talked about this morning, that most people don't think this issue matters. They don't see the assault on the gospel and the authority of Scripture. And so they think, I don't need to know about that. But I hope that tonight's sessions will help you see even more, and then maybe you can convince some people that didn't come tonight. You better come tomorrow night. You need to hear this. The origin of species, was Darwin right? The most famous evolutionist in the world is Richard Dawkins today. He is a former professor at Oxford University, world famous. He sold millions of copies of his books promoting evolution. He said this: "It is absolutely safe to say that if you meet somebody who claims not to believe in evolution, that person is ignorant, stupid, or insane, or wicked, but I'd rather not consider that. Well, I will freely admit that I am wicked, saved by the grace of Jesus Christ. But I let other people decide whether I'm ignorant, stupid, or insane." But notice something. This is a tactic that evolutionists use a lot. It's attacking people, not attacking ideas. And when you see somebody attacking people and calling names, you know they don't have a good argument. And that applies to us. We don't attack evolutionists as idiots. They're not idiots. They're very smart people. The problem is they're sinners and they're suppressing the truth in unrighteousness. There's a difference between being a sinner and being stupid. So we need to be respectful, and I am respectful of Dr. Dawkins. He's a smart man. He has a very capable friend in the United States, Lawrence Krauss, who is a very famous astrophysicist, and like Dawkins, is a very strong atheist. He says this:
"It amazes me that people have pre-existing notions that defy the evidence of reality, but that they hold on to them so dearly. And one of them is the notion of creationism."
He said, it amazes me that people have pre-existing notions that defy the evidence of reality, but they hold on to them so dearly, and one of them is the notion of creationism. Now, do you think as an atheist he has any pre-existing notions that just might defy the evidence of reality? Well, let's look and see. The evolutionary tree is represented, or the evolution view is represented by what evolutionists call the evolution tree of life. And Darwin scratched this in his notes that prepared the way for his famous book. And so they believe that all the different branches on that tree are the different kinds of plants and animals and people, and they're all descended from a common ancestor, the first microscopic single-celled creature that popped into existence in the primordial oceans by chance about 3.5 billion years ago. So I like to call this theory the microbe to microbiologist theory for the origin of living things, or from goo to you via the zoo, because that's what evolutionists believe. They never put it that way, but that's what they believe. And that view of the origin and history of life is based on some assumptions that control science today. They are the assumptions of what philosophers call naturalism. And there are two basic assumptions, and they're very easy to understand. The first assumption controlling science today is that nature or matter is all that exists. Now, not every scientist believes that. There are scientists who believe in God, but most scientists do their scientific work as if nature is all that exists. So they might believe in God on Sunday or Saturday or whenever they're going to their religious services, but when they do their science, they do it as if nature is all that exists. The second assumption controlling science is that everything can and indeed must be explained by three things: time and chance and the laws of nature working on matter. If you have those three things, time, enough of it, millions and billions of years, chance, and the laws of nature, the laws of physics and chemistry, you can explain the origin of everything. You can explain the origin of stars and galaxies, the origin of the solar system, the origin of the earth, the origin of the rock layers and fossils, the origin of the living creatures, the origin of man, the origin of language, the origin of religion. You just need enough time, chance, and the laws of nature. Well, those are the assumptions of naturalism, but they're also known by another name. Those are the assumptions of atheism. And atheism today controls science. Not all scientists are atheists, but most scientists do their scientific work as if atheism is true. Well, not all scientists accept those assumptions, and there are many who hold to a biblical worldview. And there are two basic assumptions. One is that the eternal, good, all-knowing, all-powerful, holy God exists, and he created everything else. Now, that's a very different starting assumption than nature is all that exists. And that God is not a silent God. He's a speaking God. And so the second assumption is that the Bible, God's completely truthful eyewitness testimony, explains the key events in history so that we can correctly interpret the evidence from the origin and history of the creation. So the creationist doesn't say that everything can be explained by time and chance and the laws of nature. He believes that God's word is the eyewitness testimony. God was there, the scientists were not. And he told us when he created, how he created, what order he created. And so we can use that eyewitness testimony to study the physical evidence that we see in the world. And when we open up the first page of the Bible, we read the creation account. And there on day 3, God says he created all the plants. Plants yielding seed and fruit trees on the earth bearing fruit after their kind. That phrase, after their kind, appears 3 times on day 3. It appears again twice on day 5 when God created the sea creatures and the birds to reproduce after their kind. And then it appears 4 times on day 6 when God created the land animals and people to reproduce after their kind. Now, here's a simple principle of Bible study. When you see God repeating a word or a phrase many times in a short space of a few verses, you should say, aha, I think he's trying to emphasize something. He's emphasizing that he made different kinds of creatures to reproduce after their kind. And many Christians today who have accepted the millions of years and evolution will say, you know, the Bible tells us that God created, but it doesn't tell us how God created. Oh, yes, it does, right in Genesis 1. Because 10 times God says, and God said, let there be. He created things by a spoken word. That's how he created the first kinds of plants and animals. But the text also tells us how he's going to make all the subsequent plants and animals within those kinds. That won't be by supernatural creation, God just speaking. It will be by procreation. Right there in that 3rd day, plants yielding seed. It's the seed in the first plants that will produce the next generation of plants. It's the seed in the fish and the birds and the land animals and Adam and Eve that will reproduce the next generation. They will be fruitful and multiply according to their kind. So God clearly says that he created the first plants and animals and people supernaturally. He created all subsequent ones naturally through the procreation process. Now, if you've ever seen a biology textbook, you've seen this chart. It is the modern classification of creatures, in this case related to the bear. And so you have kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. This was a system of classification developed by the great Swedish taxonomist Carolinus Linnaeus, who, by the way, was a Bible-believing young earth creationist. And you remember Charles Darwin's first book, 1859, The Origin of Species. Darwin argued in that book that species change. And he argued against a view that said, no, the species don't change. They're just the way they were when God created them at the beginning. The problem is the slippery, vague word of species, because I could point to at least 2 authors writing just a few decades before Darwin who didn't think that the original created kinds were the same as the modern classification of species. And modern creation biologists have been doing research on the reproductive powers of modern creatures, and we think in most cases the evidence would indicate that the Genesis kind, the created kind, is at the level of what modern scientists call family. So you could have more than one species develop in a kind, but that doesn't have anything to do with explaining how a microbe changed into a microbiologist. So, for example, here you have the common pheasant, which is the genus Phasianus, and the prairie chicken, a different genus. They can produce viable offspring. In other words, they can mate and have babies, and those babies can have babies. They're in the same kind, even though they're in a different genus. Or you've heard of a beefalo, the cross between a buffalo and a domestic cow. They're in two different genuses according to modern classification, but they're within the same kind. On day 6, God created mankind, but he didn't create any of those people. He created Adam and Eve. And in the genetic code of Adam and Eve was all the genetic information for making really light brown skin, medium brown skin, dark brown skin, blue eyes, green eyes, brown eyes, black hair, brown hair, blonde hair. All that variety was built into the genetic code of Adam and Eve. On day 6, he created the dog kind, but he didn't create any of those dogs. We know he didn't because those are the result of artificial breeding by humans over the last 300 to 400 years. He just created the dog kind. And in the genetic code of those original dogs was all the information for all that variety. We'll unpack that idea a little later. He created the chicken kind with lots of potential to produce great variety. God loves variety within his kinds. He created the pigeon dove kind. He created the cat kind to eventually produce big cats, small cats, spotted cats, striped cats, fast cats, not so fast cats, and really big cats, like a liger. He created the elephant kind to eventually produce the woolly mammoth, the mastodon, the African elephant, the Asian elephant, different amounts of hair, different size ears, different size tusks, but they're all the elephant kind. He created the bear kind to eventually produce the black bear, the brown bear, the grizzly bear, the polar bear. He created the alligator, crocodile kind. He created the horse kind to eventually produce the great Clydesdale, the Shetland pony, the zebra, the donkey, the zebrula, and the zonkey that we have at our Creation Museum. And he created plants after their kind. So he created the apple kind and the pine tree kind and the corn kind. Variety within the kind, but not changing into a different kind. And then we find that same phrase in Genesis 6, when God told Noah to take 2 of every kind of land, animal, and bird onto the ark. And it's the exact same Hebrew phrase. So Noah didn't take 2 of every species. Evolutionists will say that, and they'll scoff at the ark and say, well, there are millions of species. Well, for starters, most of the species live in the ocean. A very large number of the species are insects that didn't have to go in the ark. They could have floated on the surface or on mats of vegetation or other ways survived. But he took 2 of every kind of land, animal, and bird onto the ark. And so from this, we have what I call the creation forest of life. Each tree is a different kind of creature. So one of those is the dog kind. One is the cat kind. One is the elephant kind, the chicken kind, the alligator kind, and so on. And God built into those original kinds, and one of those is mankind, the ability to produce variety within their kind, but not to change into a different kind. The trees stayed distinct in the forest. Then God told Noah to take 2 of every kind onto the ark. They came off the ark. They had more time to produce variety within their kind, but one kind doesn't change to a different kind. So 2 different views for the origin and history of life. And they are the only 2 views. Some people try to combine the 2 views, but you can't do that biblically. There are really only 2 views. Either all the plants and animals are related to a common ancestor, or they're not. And if they're not, there must be separate ancestors, And there are no evolutionists that believe each of the different kinds just popped into existence by chance. So let's look at this. And before we get into any details, we need to be clear that the evolutionists and the creationists have the same creatures to study. They have the same living creatures, the same fossils, the same DNA. They're not studying different creatures, they're studying the same creatures. But if they start with naturalistic assumptions, like I've just defined, they'll come up with the idea of evolution. Darwin was using those naturalistic assumptions. He never explicitly laid them out like I did, but you can tell that's exactly how he was reasoning. But scientists who hold to biblical assumptions, they look at the very same creatures, living, fossil, DNA, and they see all kinds of evidence that confirms creation. So let's look at this, and the first thing we need to do is define a very important word, and that's the word evolution. If you look up in a biology textbook, like I have one that's widely used in my library, and it says this definition of evolution. Evolution is change, period. Well, evolution is change, but it's a certain kind of change. I'm changing. I don't look exactly like I did when I was 18 years old, although I'm quite well preserved. Thank you very much. But I'm not evolving. I'm not on the way to becoming Arnold Schwarzenegger or Superman. I'm on the way down, not on the way up. And I realize that almost every day. So that's not evolution. Evolution is a certain kind of change. I call it vertical change, from one kind of creature into a completely different kind of creature. So the first creature that popped into existence was a single-celled, microscopic, single-celled creature. And it reproduced and reproduced for about 1 billion years before the first multi-celled creature came into existence. And then those reproduced in natural selection and mutation before the first macroscopic creature that you could see without a microscope. And then those reproduced for millions of years before the first fish formed. And then it was millions of years later before one of those fish walked out onto the land and became the first amphibian. Eventually, one of the amphibians led to the first reptile. Reptiles reproduced and multiplied, but eventually one of those reptiles became the first bird. A different kind of reptile became the first mammal, and eventually those mammals evolved to be one of us. That's the story of evolution. Vertical change. Well, creationists believe in change, but we believe in horizontal change. So we believe, as the Bible says, that God created different kinds of creatures supernaturally, and he built into their genetic code to produce variety within their kind, but not to change into a different kind. Now, here's the problem. Evolutionists constantly give us examples of variation within a kind and say, see, that's evolution. No, that's not evolution. That's creation. This is evolution. And what I'm going to show you is not only is it contrary to the Bible, it's really contrary to the real scientific evidence. I want to show you that the evolutionists are confusing us. Here's a cover story from Discover magazine, very popular science magazine in America. Testing Darwin, scientists at Michigan State University prove evolution works. And you open up the article and you have a full page of these creatures, and they say in big bold font, Darwin cited the diversity of dogs as an example of accelerated evolution. Now, let me ask you a question. What are all those creatures? Dogs. Dogs changing into dogs is not evolution. That's dogs reproducing after their kind. On the next page, they have a picture of these birds. They're called Darwin's finches because Darwin studied these little birds. They're just about this big. We have some in our Creation Museum, live ones. He studied them on the Galapagos Islands off the west coast of Ecuador on his famous 5-year voyage around the world. And he noted that they were different colors and that they had different sized beaks. And he noted that the big beak finches ate big hard seeds and the little beak finches ate small soft seeds. And this article says, in big bold letters, finches played a central role in Darwin's thinking about the evolutionary process of natural selection. But this is not evolution. What are all those creatures? Well, they're not just birds. They're a certain kind of bird. They're finches. Finches changing into finches is not evolution. I want to know, where did the first finch come from? And I'm not asking a geographical question. All creationists and evolutionists agree they came from the mainland of South America. I want to know biologically how the first finch came into existence. They don't answer that. Now, they do point out that some of these finches have bigger beaks than others. All of these birds are so small you can hardly tell. But I've been doing scientific observations this weekend, and I've noticed that some of you have pretty big beaks. And, you know, I've been wondering where you are on the evolutionary tree. Good grief. This is not evolution. But now you've got another subtle problem, because they say the evolutionary process of natural selection. So if they can convince you that natural selection happens, they've proven evolution. What I'm going to show you is natural selection is not evolution. It's actually the opposite of evolution. Well, here's a biology text widely used in American high schools. And they explain to the student that there are actually two theories of evolution. There's gradualism, which involves a slow, steady change in a particular line of descent. And then there's punctuated equilibrium, which involves a stable periods interrupted by rapid change. But notice the pictures. What are all these creatures? They're all scallops. Scallops changing into scallops is not evolution. I want to know, where did the first scallop come from? They don't answer it, but this is just simply variation within a kind. There's less variation of those scallops than there are all the people in this room. And there's no evolution going on between us. So, does the fossil record confirm evolution or creation? Well, the fossil record is in the rock layers of the earth, which we don't see in most places. They're under this church and under my home in northern Kentucky. But we see them in road cuts along the freeways and in beautiful places like the Grand Canyon. And this is a chart that evolutionists have in the textbooks and museums showing what they believe is the evolution of life from what they call simple bottom-dwelling sea creatures, although those creatures at the bottom of the chart are not simple at all. Here's a chart from Scientific American showing mammal evolution. And it shows you all these mammals up at the top. Land mammals, flying mammals, swimming mammals. And it shows you that they are all related to a common ancestor, the first mammal, which evolved from a non-mammal. Now you'll notice that they've got dotted blue lines connecting the branches. I want to know, do they have fossil evidence for the dotted blue lines? Well, they don't tell you in the article. So I call in as my expert witness the late Dr. Stephen Jay Gould, professor of geology and paleontology at Harvard University, one of America's leading experts on the fossil record. He was an atheist Jew until his death. He was one of the more honest evolutionists, and he said this: the extreme rarity of transitional forms in the fossil record persists as the trade secret of paleontology. The evolutionary trees that adorn our textbooks have data only at the tips and the nodes of their branches. The rest is inference, however reasonable, not the evidence of fossils. He said, we don't have the evidence for the branches. And it's for this reason that he became an advocate of punctuated equilibrium, which is the view that says evolution happened in small populations in a relatively short period of time, and that's why we don't have any fossil evidence. Well, the gradualist said, you don't have any biological mechanism for such rapid evolution. And the punctuated equilibrium said, yeah, but you gradualists don't have any fossil evidence for slow, gradual evolution. And the creationist said, you're both right. Well, that was 1977, and you might say, well, good grief, that was 40 years ago. Science is advancing so rapidly in knowledge. They've got the fossil evidence now. Well, they didn't in 2001. Ernst Mayr was the greatest evolutionist of the 20th century, a zoologist at Harvard University. He also was an atheist until his death. He said, given the fact of evolution, one would expect the fossils to document a gradual, steady change from ancestral forms to the descendants. But this is not what the paleontologist finds. Instead, he or she finds gaps in just about every phyletic series. The discovery of unbroken series of species changing gradually into descending species is very rare. And those rare examples, when they're critically evaluated, don't stand up to scrutiny. One of the most popular recent proofs of evolution is Tiktaalik rosei. That's the fossil evidence they found. Not a lot to work with. But in one evolutionist report, they had a picture of what he supposedly looked like when he was alive. And they said, they called it the fish tetrapod transitional form. That is the transitional form from a creature that lives in the water to a creature that lives on the land. And they said, this is the most compelling example yet of fish-amphibian transition. But creationists would contend it looks like a well-equipped lobe-finned fish, similar to the living Australian lungfish, which is perfectly adapted for its life. So that's not proof of evolution. And if you want to learn more about that, if you go to our website and just type in Tiktaalik, you can read an article about that. So I go back to that chart in Scientific American, and you can see that I erased the dotted blue lines because Dr. Gould and Dr. Mayer said, we don't have fossil evidence for the branches. But we got to do something else with the chart, because as far down in the fossil record that we find a kangaroo, what do you think it looks like? 100% kangaroo. As far down in the fossil record as we find a bat, guess what it looks like? 100% bat. So it's cheating to bend those blue bars towards the middle, because the blue bars are not in the fossil record. They're on this page of the magazine. So we'll just straighten those so we can see the fossil evidence. And that looks like different kinds of creatures have always been different kinds of creatures, just like Genesis says. Dr. Gould, in that article I quoted, said that there were two characteristics of the fossil record: abrupt appearance and stasis. By that he meant the very first time that a creature appears in the lowest rock layer, it appears abruptly, fully formed, fully functional, fully recognizable. And then as we come up through the rock layers, the creature basically stays the same. Oh, it might have a longer snout or a shorter snout, or longer legs or shorter legs, but it's the same kind of creature. Well, abrupt appearance and stasis is just another way of saying what God said, created after their kinds. I want to show you this abrupt appearance and stasis. Here's a dragonfly from a rock layer, supposedly 200 million years old. Looks exactly like a modern dragonfly. Here's an ant, supposedly 135 million years old. Looks just like an ant today. Here's a nautilus, supposedly 114 million years old. Looks exactly like nautilus swimming in the ocean today. And nobody would have any trouble identifying what that is. Even after 50 million years, it hasn't changed. So when we really look at the fossil record and we read what honest evolutionists tell us, we don't have any fossil evidence for evolution. But what we see fits beautifully with what the Bible says. Well, let's go on to living creatures. Do they confirm evolution or creation? And there's not an evolutionist on this planet, alive today or any time in the past, who would come up to this scene on a beach in Florida and say, isn't it amazing what time and chance and the laws of nature washed up on the shore? They'd all know this is the result of creative intelligence. The sand art, with the words, "Thank you, Jesus," that's conveying information to us. The picture of Jesus on the cross is conveying information to us. The placards stuck in the sand with Bible verses on them are conveying information to us. That's the result of creative intelligence. You could have 1 trillion years and the ocean would never wash any of that up onto the shore. Werner Gitt is a German former retired director and professor at the German Federal Institute of Physics and Technology. He is a Bible-believing Christian, a young earth creationist, and he is an expert on information theory. That's what he devoted his whole scientific career to studying. And in his book, In the Beginning Was Information, he said this: there is no known law of nature, no known process, and no known sequence of events which can cause information to originate by itself in matter. Now, you're reading information up there on the screen, but there's nothing in that screen that's produced that information. It's just reflecting light from that projector. But there's nothing inside that projector that's produced that information. It's picking up an electric signal from my computer. But there's nothing inside my computer that produced that information. I pushed on the keys of my computer to make the images of those English letters, of those English words. Well, how did I know what keys to push? I was looking at Dr. Gitt's book. Well, how did the information get into Dr. Gitt's book? Well, you know, it was an explosion in a paper and ink factory. No, it came from Dr. Gitt's mind. And he typed on his computer and made a manuscript, sent it off to the printer. That's how the information got into the book. Information always comes from a mind. Here you have some really pretty clouds. They're the result of time and chance and the laws of nature. The wind blowing around water molecules and dust particles. But they don't convey any information. But there's no evolutionist that believes that those are the result of time and chance and the laws of nature. That took a lot of intelligence. First, to make the whatever stuff is that comes out of the back of the airplane and hangs there for a while. And then the pilot who figured out how to make the airplane and fly the airplane and spell with his rear end. I mean, that takes a lot of intelligence. Here are some beautiful rocks. They're the result of time and chance and the laws of nature. Wind and water erosion beating against those rocks. But there are no evolutionists who believe those rocks are the result of time and chance and the laws of nature. That's the result of creative intelligence. Now think about this. If those stone heads carved into that rock face are the result of creative intelligence, how intelligent, how rational, how scientific, how logical is it to think that the actual heads on the living bodies of those presidents is the result of time and chance and the laws of nature? I submit to you that is irrational, illogical, and unscientific. Now, these are some amazing objects. I've never seen them come into existence, but I am absolutely confident that they are the result of a tornado blowing through a junkyard. No. Those are the result of a great quantity of intellectual activity, of people who designed them, who did the blueprints, who made the instructions for the engineers to make stuff and assemble it all. But those things are simple compared to the simplest living things. That is not the simplest living thing, but it is a microscopic insect called the midge. And it has a complex mouth, compound eyes, those antenna-like features, hair-like features. There's nothing simple about this guy. And unlike those things, this whole nother complicated process based on information. Where did the information come from for making that creature and all other living things? Well, it comes from a molecule called the DNA molecule. It's a molecule in virtually every cell of your and my body and the cells of every plant and animal. And just as the English language is made up of 26 letters, and you can combine them in different ways to make words and sentences and whole books of information, so there is a biological language represented by 4 letters, C, T, G, and A, and those can be combined together to make biological words, sentences, and whole books of information. It's like the Morse code. If you knew the Morse code and you had a rope and some beads and rods, you could spell the word help. You just need to know the code. And if you had a long enough rope and enough beads and rods, you could spell the whole Bible. You just need enough rope, beads, and rods. But the rope, beads, and rods are not creating the information. They're simply carrying the information in the coded sequence. Well, DNA is like that. It's a chemical language that is carrying the information for making plants and animals and people. And the DNA molecule is the most compact information storage system known to man. It makes our most powerful microcomputer chips look like nothing in comparison. And it has been estimated that if you took all of the human DNA that you could fit on the head of a pin, that would be equivalent to about 155 million human DNA molecules. They're really, really tiny. And they would carry the amount of information equivalent to a stack of books from the Earth to the Moon 240 times. Or a stack of CDs 1,800 kilometers high. That's an enormous amount of information. In fact, Richard Dawkins, who I quoted at the beginning, said that the amount of information in virtually every cell, DNA molecule in virtually every cell of your and my body is equivalent to 3 to 4 sets of the 20 volumes of the Encyclopedia Britannica. That's an enormous amount of information. And it will determine whether you're a boy or a girl, whether you have black hair or blonde hair, whether you have really dark brown skin or light brown skin, blue eyes or green eyes, whether you be tall in stature, short in stature, robust or petite, whether you'll have hair when you're 60 years old or you've lost it all. All of that is coded in the DNA. Well, you know what DNA stands for? It stands for deoxyribonucleic acid. But that's way too difficult to remember. Much easier way. Definitely no accident. Because information doesn't come about by accident. Now, Bill Gates, the founder of Microsoft, should know this. But I have a strong feeling, I'm almost certain he's an evolutionist, but he shouldn't be. He said, DNA is like a software program, but far, far more advanced than any software we've ever created. Now, let me ask you a question. Is there anyone who believes that Microsoft Windows software is the result of time and chance and the laws of nature? Is there anybody? Well, I do sometimes. When I'm really frustrated. And then in a moment of sober reflection, I remember that there are some really smart software engineers out there in Seattle, and they just weren't thinking of me when they designed that particular feature. Now, how rational is it, how scientific is it to think that Microsoft Windows software is the result of creative intelligence, but the brains and the bodies of the Microsoft software engineers is the result of time and chance and the laws of nature? I submit that is irrational, illogical, and unscientific. Well, if we're going to explain the origin of living things, we've got to answer two questions, two key questions. The first is, how did the DNA information for the supposed first living microscopic creature come into existence? Now, for the creationists, that's really easy. The infinitely intelligent, eternal creator spoke that information and the creature into existence. But the evolutionist only has time and chance and the laws of nature. So how are they going to explain this? Well, in 1953, the year I was born, Stanley Miller, a graduate student, and his supervisor designed this apparatus to simulate the conditions of the primordial atmosphere of the Earth and the chemicals that they thought were in the atmosphere. They simulated a lightning strike to see what they would produce. And they produced some amino acids, which are the building blocks of life, but they're not life. They produced an equal amount of right-handed and left-handed amino acids. But in living things, there are only left-handed amino acids. Right-handed are fatal for life. But most of what they produced was worthless, tarry goo. Well, a lot of people thought they were just on the verge of creating life in the test tube. Of course, if they had, that wouldn't show it didn't take any intelligence, right? But Stanley Miller went on, he got his PhD. He devoted his whole scientific career to trying to answer the question, how did the first living cell come into existence? He died at age 77 without a clue. Paul Davies is a world-famous astrobiologist, teaches at Arizona State University. Astrobiology is an interesting field of science. They study life in outer space. but they've never found any life in outer space, not even a bacterium. So they study life on Earth, and they imagine life in outer space. But Paul Davies said, how did stupid atoms spontaneously write their own software? Nobody knows. There is no known law of physics able to create information from nothing. Well, that sounds surprisingly just like Werner Gitt, the creationist. But the evolutionists are constantly telling the public that creation scientists aren't real scientists. They don't know what they're talking about. They're pseudoscientists. No, they do know what they're talking about. And again, when somebody calls another person a pseudoscientist, when they really have a scientific degree from a respected scientific university, that's name calling, that's not refuting arguments. So on this first question, evolution is a blind leap of faith. That unknown chemicals came together in an unknown way, at an unknown place, at an unknown time, using an unknown process to produce the first living single-celled organism. It's a blind leap of faith. And right there, the theory of evolution is dead in the water. I spoke at a university, actually 9 out of 10 years in a row. I was invited by the professor, an evolutionist, to come and speak to his class on evolution. And one time after I spoke, I found out from another student who was there, who said he disagreed on this point because he said, evolution isn't about the origin of the first living cell. And my response is, oh, yes, it is. And in every biology textbook used in our schools, they start out with explaining Miller's experiment. And if you can't explain how you get the first living cell by time and chance and the laws of nature, the theory of evolution is dead, because natural selection and mutations don't work on dead chemicals. They only work on a living, reproducing organism. So this is part of it. And creationists can answer the first question, but evolutionists haven't got a clue. After over 70 years of research, millions of research dollars, probably thousands of really smart scientists, they have no idea. Well, let's suppose, for the sake of argument, that somehow the first living cell did pop into existence by chance from non-living matter. Have no idea how that could happen, but let's suppose it did. Then the second question is, how did the DNA information in the first single-celled creature get changed and augmented or added to produce all the different plants and animals that we see in the fossil record and living today? In other words, how do you go from goo to you via the zoo? And the evolutionists have two supposed main mechanisms: natural selection and random mutations. And we'll discuss each of these in turn. They're not difficult ideas to understand. First thing I want to say is that natural selection is a fact. All creationists, if they're informed, believe in natural selection. But natural selection is not evolution, as I'm going to show you. And natural selection is a creative process. It is a conservative process, not a creative process. And the name even tells you that. Natural selection. Nature is selecting from what's already there. If all the animals in the world died and all we had was crocodiles, crocodiles could reproduce for trillions of years. And they would never produce a fish, a bird, a mammal, or a person. Because there's no genetic information in crocodiles and alligators for producing feathers or hair or gills. Well, here's proof of evolution. Dr. Michael Majerus is one of the most famous British evolutionists, professor at Cambridge University until his death in 2009. Probably an atheist also. He said, the peppered moth is perhaps the most visually impacting and easily understood example of Darwinian evolution in action. It should be taught. It is, after all, the proof of evolution. His emphasis in the bold. What's he talking about? Well, he's talking about an example that is in almost every textbook in every country of the world, the peppered moths. Bistone betullaria is the scientific name, and it comes in two varieties, the dark variety and the light variety. And the evolutionary story goes this way. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, these moths would sit on the bark of the tree, and the peppered moth was, the light moth was camouflaged, so the birds ate more of the dark moth. But as the Industrial Revolution was progressing, factories were burning coal, soot was coming out, it was pollutants that killed the lichen on the tree, and the trees got darker, and pretty soon the light moth was visible and the dark moth was camouflaged. And so the birds ate more of those. And the evolutionists say, see, this is evolution in action. No, this is not evolution at all. Because we had light and dark peppered moths before the Industrial Revolution. We had light and dark peppered moths after the Industrial Revolution. The moths didn't change. The only thing that changed was the population ratios. If I gave this lecture tomorrow night, and almost everybody in the room was African American and there were a few Caucasians, we wouldn't say that's evolution. We'd say, no, there was just a population change. And when they cleaned up the environment, guess what happened? The light variety began to be more numerous. This may be evidence of natural selection, although there are even evolutionists who question that. But it's not proof of microbe to microbiologist evolution. If you want to read more about that, we have an article on our website. Well, let's look at this some more by looking at the dog kind, the genus Canis. This is a chart out of an evolutionary textbook. And it shows you on the outside the wild dogs, and then a representative of the domestic dog in the middle. And it has those arrows showing that the wild dogs could breed with the domestic dogs. They don't normally, either because we keep our dogs in our house or fenced in yards. And the wild dogs could breed with each other. They don't normally, either because they don't live near each other or they like to marry somebody that looks or smells like them. But creationists and evolutionists are in agreement that this is the dog kind and that probably the first dog was a dog, something like a gray wolf. And in the genetic code of those first dogs was all the genetic information for producing eventually a coyote, a dingo, a collie, a bulldog, and even a poodle. Although you'd probably have to throw in a few thousand mutations to make a poodle. But this is not evolution because this involves a loss of genetic information. So if all the dogs died except poodles, you could breed those poodles till the cows come home. Give you as much time as you want, trillions of years. They'd never produce a gray wolf because they've lost genetic information. Now, here's the most beautiful dog in the world. That's my dog, Ergie. She's completely black, black lab. A couple of years ago, we mated her with Zeke, a really nice guy. He's completely black. And Ergie had puppies. And she had 2 yellow, 2 chocolate, and 3 black. Whoa, what's going on here? Is that evolution? No. The genetic information for chocolate and yellow labs was in the genetic code of Ergie and Zeke. We could breed those 2 dogs as many times as we want. We'd never produce a pink puppy, a blue puppy, a green puppy, because there's no genetic information in labs for pink and blue and green hair. Well, let's look at this with hair length. Now, it's more complicated than this because there's more than one gene controlling hair length, but we'll just keep it simple to illustrate the point. And sometimes genes do blend together to make a medium effect. So let's say you have a gene for short hair and a gene for long hair. And so the mom and dad are both medium length hair. If they have puppies, what are they going to produce? Well, if they have enough puppies, they're going to produce short-haired puppies because they get the short-haired gene from mom and the short-haired gene from dad. They'll produce some just like themselves because they get the short-haired gene from one parent and the long-haired gene from the other. And if they have enough puppies, they'll produce long-haired puppies. They get the long-haired gene from one, the short-haired gene or the long-haired gene from the other. That's not evolution. That's just shuffling the genetic code. My wife and I have 8 children. We have 3 sons and 5 daughters. Yeah, that's right. That's right. Sometimes I get confused with that many. None of them look exactly alike. None of them look exactly like my wife and I. A couple of them are like me that if we want to go out and suntan in the summer, we turn red lobster. My wife goes out and works in the garden, beautiful golden tan. And some of my other kids, they have really nice tans. They're all our kids. It's just genetic variation. Okay, so you have the dogs come off the ark, and they start to have puppies, and they're producing variety within their dog kind. And there are no fences in the post-flood world, so they're going to follow their nose wherever they want to go. And so some of those dogs are going to migrate up into Europe from the mountains of Ararat. And it's getting colder and colder as they go north. And pretty soon those short and long, medium-length dogs, they freeze to death. And only the long-haired dogs survive through the winter to have puppies. And what are they going to have? In the spring, they're only going to have long-haired puppies because they've lost the genetic information for short hair. The opposite happens for the dogs migrating down into Africa. It's getting hotter and hotter, and those long-haired dogs are panting. They can't cool off their system. They die of heat exhaustion. And the short-haired dogs say, man, it's fantastic down here. And they survive and have puppies. And then the medium-length hair dogs, they stay in the temperate zones, and they continue to produce variety. So natural selection is at work. Nature is selecting the dogs that have the right characteristics for a particular environment. But this is not evolution, because all the genetic information for short and long hair was in the dogs that came off the ark. So natural selection can explain the survival of the fittest, but it does not explain the arrival of the fittest, which is the real question. Where did dogs come from in the first place? How do you get a dog from a non-dog? In a biblical view, natural selection is the God-designed method of preserving representatives of the original created kinds in a fallen world. God knew when he created at the beginning that man would sin and that he would curse the creation. He knew that man would continue to sin and he would flood the world with a global flood that would radically change the environment and the conditions for life. And so he built into those original created kinds the ability to produce variety within their kind so that he wouldn't have to constantly do miracles all the time to keep the operation going. So natural selection can't explain how you can go from goo to you via the zoo. So do mutations supply the new information for evolution? Well, what's a mutation? Well, a mutation is a change in the DNA sequence compared to the ancestral, to the mom and dad. And this can be caused by the corruption in the copying process of copying the DNA in the mom and dad that's joined together to make an offspring, or harmful mutagens and other processes. And so this is an example of a mutation. This is called a TNR. That's technical for totally naked rooster. Now, he would not do well in the wild. He'd freeze to death out there. He doesn't have any feathers because of a mutation in his DNA that didn't allow him to make feathers. Nature would select him out. I saw this guy at an alligator preserve in Florida a few years ago. He was in a cage all by himself. He has white eyes, white fingernails, white skin, and a little sign on his enclosure said, this is the result of a mutation. He couldn't produce melanin that makes him green, and alligators green. And I learned something new that day. The pigment in our skin that makes our skin various shades of brown is melanin. The pigment in alligators and crocodiles is melanin. It's always fun to learn something new. But he would not do well in the wild because he wouldn't be able to hide from what wants to kill him and what he wants to eat. So nature would select him out. So sometimes mutations cause a loss of genetic information. Sometimes they cause a duplication of information. Like this Chinese boy who was born with 15 fingers and 16 toes. He had genetic information for making toes and fingers. He just made too many. And that was not helpful. And the doctors did surgery on him, and he now has the right number. These fruit flies have been the object of a lot of evolutionary research. They bombard normal fruit flies with radiation to see what kind of mutations they can produce. And they've produced fruit flies with fringed wings, with little tiny vestigial wings, with no wings at all, with legs growing out of the eyeballs, with extra wings, but no muscles to run those wings, so they get in the way of the wings at work. None of these are an improvement on the fruit fly. And if they let them out into the wild, nature would select them out because they're not fit for survival. They survive in the laboratory for research. So mutations are a fact. All creationists, if they're informed, believe in mutations. But mutations nearly always reduce the genetic information, and they have never been observed to increase functional genetic information to produce new body parts or new body functions that weren't in the parents. And again, this is not difficult to understand. If you had a desktop computer and you took the side of the tower off and you had a box of computer parts and you had a 2-year-old and you said, now little Johnny, you can change any part in the computer for any part in the box. And if Johnny could make changes like that, and you never let him take a nap, you never let him go to sleep at night, you just keep changing that because we want to see that desktop, that laptop computer come into existence. Would that happen? No. Probably the first change Johnny made would kill the computer. A blind, directionless, natural process, like a 2-year-old changing computer parts, would never produce that. Lee Spetner is an expert on mutations. He's a Jewish scientist, and he wrote the book Not by Chance, Shattering the Modern Theory of Evolution, in which he said, all point mutations that have been studied on the molecular level turn out to reduce the genetic information and not to increase it. So you have the DNA for an amoeba. It has all the information for making every aspect of an amoeba. But it doesn't have any genetic information for making hair, legs, stomach, a tongue. Horse DNA has that. But you can't make horse DNA by taking amoeba DNA and copying it over and over, and every time you copy it, you make a mistake. Well, at this point, evolutionists will often say, okay, we agree that most mutations are either harmful or neutral, but, they say, there are beneficial mutations. Now we've got another slippery word, beneficial. You've maybe all heard this. Every so often you read about it in the newspaper. Evolution happening right before our eyes. Bacteria developing resistance to antibiotics in the hospital. Anybody ever heard that? Yeah, that's not evolution. Let me give you an example. H. pylori is a little critter, a bacterium that causes ulcers in humans. Doctors have figured out how to kill this bacterium. They've developed an antibiotic. They give the antibiotic to the patient. It's absorbed through the cell wall of this little bacterium, and by research, the scientists know that that bacterium produces an enzyme that will convert that antibiotic into a poison, and it kills the bacterium. So it's a pretty slick, it's basically a form of assisted suicide. But there are mutant H. pyloris. And because of a mutation, they absorb that antibiotic through the cell wall, but because of a mutation, they can't produce the enzyme, so they can't convert that antibiotic into a poison. So no enzyme, no poison, no death. They've survived because of a mutation, but it involved a loss of genetic information. So the patient takes the medicine, it kills off the normal H. pylori, the mutant has babies, and then the doctors have to figure out a different antibiotic to kill that one. But the mutant is not an improvement on the bacterium, and it's not being changed into something other than H. pylori. It's actually a defective H. pylori that has an advantage in the hospital in the presence of antibiotic. If they were both out in the wild, sitting in the soil, the normal one would have the advantage. Well, the Bible says we know that the whole creation groans and suffers the pains of childbirth together until now. So in a biblical view, mutations are the God-ordained consequences of his curse on creation because of Adam's sin. So in the very beginning, there were no mutations, no death, no disease. But today we have about 6,000 genetic diseases in the human race. But when Jesus comes again, he's going to create a new heavens and new earth. There isn't going to be any more death, no more suffering, no more disease, no more mutations. So the evolution tree of life, the creation forest of life. When we really look at the fossil, genetic, and living evidence, there is no real scientific evidence for evolution. What we see fits beautifully with what the Bible says. So in summary, natural selection is a fact. Mutations are a fact. But natural selection plus mutations equals molecule to man evolution. That's not a fact. That's a myth, being taught as unquestioned fact in every school virtually in the world. And I conclude that because regarding the chance origin of the simplest life, information does not come from matter. It comes from a mind. But the evolutionists deny that there's a mind outside the creation. And as far as evolution in the past, there are no indisputable transitional fossils. There's just a handful of highly debatable examples that are either examples of variation within a kind or misinterpretation, or, as we'll see in the next lecture, at least one case of deliberate fraud. As far as evolution going on today, nature doesn't produce any new information. It just shuffles existing information or loses information. Well, so what? Does it matter? Yes, it does. Ingrid Newkirk, founder of the People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, said this: "There's no rational basis for saying that a human being has special rights. When it comes to having a central nervous system and the ability to feel pain, hunger, and thirst, a rat is a pig, is a dog, is a boy. They're all animals." Now, she says that because she's concerned about cruelty to animals. And the Bible actually teaches that we shouldn't be cruel to animals. There's a problem here, because I'm sure she's an evolutionist with that thinking. And according to evolutionists, plants are also living. And therefore, eating plants is killing. And if you don't eat plants and you don't eat animals, it's going to be tough as a human being. But you can turn her words right on their head. If a rat is a pig, is a dog, is a boy, we have slaughterhouses for pigs. So what's wrong with killing babies in the womb? Get rid of spare cats, get rid of spare kids. Our first dog, Shadow, developed severe diabetes and blindness at the age of 7. It just broke our heart to see her tripping down the stairs and bumping into the car. So we finally made a family decision to take her to the vet and put her down. My mom, 93 years old, she had glaucoma, macular degeneration, and an incurable heart disease. Should I take her to the vet and put her down? Oh no, my mom's made in the image of God. She died peacefully when God was ready for her to go. There's a big difference between my dog and my mom. Richard Dawkins, who I quoted at the beginning, tweeted on Twitter a couple of years ago, "With respect to those meanings of human that are relevant to the morality of abortion, any fetus is less human than an adult pig." The reason that we tolerate abortion today is because we have been evolutionized. And notice what happened. Just recently, the House of Representatives passed a bill that would prevent any abortions after 20 weeks because we can scientifically prove that the baby feels pain. But you know what? The pro-abortionists, they don't want to admit that that's a baby from the moment of conception. It's something other than a baby. It's something other than a human being. No, it's not. It's a human being from conception. And all the genetic information in that first fertilized egg, all it needs is food and protection and growth. It matters what we believe about where everything came from. It further matters when we consider Adolf Hitler killed 10 to 15 million Jews, handicapped people, gypsies. Joseph Stalin killed 20 to 23 million Russians. The Japanese emperor of the Second World War, Hirohito, killed 6 million Chinese, Koreans. Margaret Sanger, who founded Planned Parenthood, she was a racist. She wanted, and Planned Parenthood has fulfilled her wishes. A very large percentage of her Planned Parenthood clinics are in the poor communities of America. She targeted the black community. Pol Pot, the Cambodian leader, 1 to 3 million people out of 8 million people in his country were destroyed. And Mao Zedong, 49 to 78 million. Now, Christians have done things that are wrong. The Crusades were wrong. The fighting in Northern Ireland between the Protestants and the Catholics that involved death of people, that was wrong. But the people who were involved in those things were doing things against the Bible's teaching, not because of the Bible's teaching. But these people are applying evolutionary thinking consistently to their moral and political movements. Evolution theory has been a massively deadly theory. Well, Romans 1 says, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who suppress the truth in unrighteousness, because that which is known about God is evident within them, for God made it evident to them. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made, so that they are without excuse." The fingerprints of God are all over his creation. And if a person can't see it, it's not because he can't, it's because he won't. He's suppressing the truth in unrighteousness. Most of the scientists in the world today say everything evolved from a single cell. Take my word for it. God says, I created distinct kinds to stay distinct. Take my word for it. Whose word are you going to take? And it's really not a choice between science and the Bible, because real science confirms exactly what the Bible says. But most Christians don't know that. Most of our theologians don't know that. And so that's why we've developed resources to help people have answers. And the answers books answer the 130 most asked questions. And it's just amazing to me. They're not difficult answers. And most Christians, including most Christian seminary professors and college professors, they can't answer the questions. Where did Cain get his wife? That's asked in every country we've been in. It's easy to answer when we pay attention to the Bible and know just a teeny little bit about genetics. Where did the so-called races come from? As I'm going to show you in the next lecture, there's really only one race, the human race. There's no such thing as a black race and a white race, a brown race, a red race. But how do you explain that? A little bit of genetics, a little bit of the Bible. It's easy to explain. Where did the dinosaurs come from? What about the days of Genesis? Were they really literal? Was the flood of Noah really global, or was it just a flood in the Middle East? These are great resources. And then we've got answers books for the little kids to help them at preschool. We need to start teaching them. You know, tomorrow I'll probably ask, I'm sure I will ask the kids in the K through 6 group tomorrow morning if they've ever heard of the word evolution. They'll raise their hands. If they've ever heard millions of years, they'll raise their hands. And maybe all of them are homeschooled. Well, they're hearing it. They're hearing it all over. And if you're homeschooling and you say, well, you know, I don't really need to worry about this because we're teaching Answers in Genesis stuff in our homeschool. Well, sooner or later, your kids are going to grow up and they're going to go out into the world. And if they're going to be a witness, they're going to have to witness to people that have been thoroughly evolutionized. And what we see happen is kids who are taught creation but aren't taught creation apologetics and aren't given scientific training, they become sitting ducks for the evolutionists in university because they just have a shallow understanding and they haven't been given answers to see through what their professors are saying. So really encourage you to take advantage of the resources, the DVDs that answer about a third of those questions. This lecture is available if you want to watch it again or share it with somebody else. And our Answers magazine that comes 6 times a year you can get 1 free DVD for each year that you subscribe, up to 3 years. This is an introductory book on evolution by J. Seegert. Just a very good introductory book. If you want something more meaty, or you know somebody, you have a child who's maybe drifted away because they've sat under PhD professors in the university who have really persuaded them that evolution is fact, then I'd encourage you to get this one by Dr. John Sanford. He was a plant geneticist researcher at Cornell University his whole scientific career. He invented the gene gun, which is used widely by scientists. And he didn't become a Christian until he was 39. It was another 11 years before he became a young earth creationist, but he's now a solid creationist. And this is a powerful book on mutations and showing that mutations are absolutely fatal to the theory of evolution. Great book. And this book just came out a few weeks ago. Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson is on our staff. He has a PhD in cell biology from a little-known school that uses just flannel graph. It's called Harvard University. And this is, well, the title is Replacing Darwin, because he's making an audacious claim. When Darwin published his theory, he knew nothing about genetics because they didn't know anything. Darwin thought that life came from a simple blob of protoplasm. He had no idea what the microscopic world was like. Genetics is key to the question of origins, and Darwin didn't know anything about it. And Dr. Jeanson is making a bold proposal for a new origins of species. So he's contacted several leading evolutionists and offered to send them the book free. They've declined. Their minds are closed. It doesn't matter that he has a PhD from Harvard. He's an idiot. He can't possibly know what he's talking about. But think about this. If he's really an idiot who got a PhD from Harvard, then that means that the professors at Harvard University are totally incompetent. That they can't even realize that they had an idiot in their program and they gave a degree to him. No, this is not the case. Nathaniel's a smart guy. Not infallible, but he's a smart guy. Any books or DVDs you can combine together and save a lot of money that way. You get the free newsletter and lots on our website, over 10,000 articles. Don't write to us and ask us a question until you first search on our website, because we probably already answered the question. And we also have a technical research journal. Creationists or evolutionists will say, creationists aren't real scientists because they don't publish in the respected peer-reviewed scientific literature. Well, one, that's a lie. They do publish in that literature. They just don't publish their creationist research in those journals, because if they submitted them, they would go in the garbage can. They would not be sent out for review. So we have to publish our research in creationist journals. But of course, then they say, well, see, that's biased. Oh, so the secular journals that are controlled by evolutionists, they're not biased? So great resource there, and there's some really good articles on the created kinds there. And don't forget to pick up some leaflets about the Ark in the museum. Okay, we'll take a 15-minute break or so, and then we'll come back and talk about human origins and show how we are really being brainwashed.